This government has made me a victim of conspiracy theories because they haven't answered fully or allowed anyone to ask the true questions of September 11th.
I spent a lot of time on the computer. I started reading every single article that I could get my hands on.
There was no sleeping at the beginning because we were grieving. It was hard to lay down. So I would spend all night just researching.
Our families didn't want us asking these questions. That was painful. We should just be grieving and healing. Well, part of our healing process is finding out exactly what happened.
By November, it had become the sense among most 9/11 families that an independent investigation would be necessary to do what the Justice Department and the news media seemed unwilling to do.
We felt that the country was at risk from terrorists and from incompetence, and maybe worse.
We wanted a commission that was going to be independent, nothing to do with the government, because we were going to have to investigate the government. They're the agencies that failed on 9/11 across the board.
We went door to door in Congress and the Senate and got told, don't worry about it. They're going to do their own hearings. You know what? The agencies will investigate themselves. They'll have their own internal reports.
Leaders in Congress said, don't worry, we're going to investigate 9/11. So the women were stunned when President Bush convinced Congress to back off. He reportedly told congressional leaders that a sweeping investigation might distract from the government's war on terrorism. Then the women heard that some frustrated legislators were trying to launch another, broader investigation. But the president and his allies in Congress were trying to block that. And that's when the women got together and said, let's organize a protest in Washington.
9/11 families rallied at the Capitol to press for answers.
We need a full independent investigation. We must ask the tough questions and seek out the difficult answers.
That was the first time we all got together in a new direction to push for the commission.
Sharing many of the same questions and concerns, a coalition of family members began to take form. Its goal, a formal investigation.
The New Jersey women and a handful of other survivors had a series of meetings at the White House. Some were reportedly rather heated. But in the end, President Bush changed his position.
President Bush had at first opposed any independent commission, but he reversed himself under pressure from the families of 9/11 victims. President Bush signed legislation today creating an independent commission to investigate the September 11th attack on America. The president named a supporter, Dr. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State in the Nixon and Ford administrations, to head the panel.
He has a penchant for secrecy, which is not what's needed here. There are questions about his role in Vietnam, his role in the coup in Chile.
Several family members approached Kissinger and requested a meeting at his office in New York. Prior to the meeting, Kristen Breitweiser conducted a thorough investigation of Kissinger's potential conflicts of interest.
Probably much to the chagrin of some of the people in the room, Lori asked some very pointed questions. Would you have any Saudi American clients that you would like to tell us about? And he was very uncomfortable, kind of twisting and turning on the couch. And then she asked whether he had any clients by the name of Bin Laden. And he just about fell off his couch.
Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger stepped down from the position Friday.
We thought the meeting went well.
Kissinger was soon replaced by Tom Keene, a former New Jersey governor, and former Congressman Lee Hamilton, who had chaired the House Intelligence Committee. The remaining 8 commissioners were all former D.C. insiders. To monitor the commission, leading victim relatives established the Family Steering Committee. The group provided the commissioners with hundreds of well-researched questions for which they expected answers. In March of 2003, 441 days after the attacks, the official investigation began.
I will never understand why it took us a year to fight for something that only makes good sense. You fail, you want to find out what you did wrong, and you want to fix it.
From the outset, many families were concerned by how the investigation was being conducted.
We begged and pleaded that people should be put under oath. At the beginning, they were not.
As the hearings progressed, the families were becoming more and more frustrated by what they perceived as softball questioning from the commissioners.
We have certain questions that we, families, wrote for each of the people that were coming to testify today. And the questions weren't asked.
Complete waste of time. It was a bunch of people throwing accolades at each other and asking the same questions one after the other.
Skirting around issues, not being defined enough in their questions.
It's a stonewall. It's a cover-up. As far as I'm concerned, I'm very bitter. I'm very angry.
Tim Romer is a member of this commission. He's a former Democratic congressman. Romer says the commission wouldn't exist if it weren't for the 4 New Jersey widows.
President Bush was quick to use 9/11 to build up his image. At the same time, he is refusing to cooperate fully with the commission investigating the attacks on America.
The co-chair of the 9/11 Commission itself admits to us that the process he headed up was seriously flawed.
So there are all kinds of reasons. We thought we were set up to fail. We got started late. We had a very short time frame. Indeed, we had to get it extended. We did not have enough money. They were afraid we were going to hang somebody, that we would point the finger.
The commission in many ways was set up to fail because we had not enough money. We didn't have enough time. We'd been appointed by the most partisan people in Washington.
I'm a member of the commission. The president has said only a minority of the commission can see a minority of the documents, and then they have to clear what they're going to say to the rest of the commission with the White House. I'm in favor of subpoenaing the White House for the documents we need so that all the commissioners can get to see all the documents that we need. That's the only way we can face the American people and the families and say we have done a thorough investigation independently of the White House and the entire executive branch.
Why won't they let you see this? What do they say?
Access. They don't want any more eyeballs to see their documents than they can possibly get away with. It's a scam. It's absolutely disgusting.
The attorney for the 9/11 Commission, John Farmer, cited that there was a decision at some point not to tell the American people the truth.
The majority of the commissioners felt that the commission had been lied to, deliberately obstructed, undermined by the White House, or set up with staff that had conflicts of interest in the investigation. Commission members even considered bringing criminal charges against Pentagon officials who had deliberately lied to them about the military's lack of response on that day.
A new book by 9/11 Commission co-chairman Tom Kane and Lee Hamilton outlines repeated misstatements by the Pentagon and Federal Aviation Administration. They write, fog of war could explain why some people were confused on the day of 9/11, but it could not explain why all of the after-action reports, accident investigations, and public testimony by FAA and NORAD officials advanced an account of 9/11 that was untrue.
But the fact that they would continue and perpetuate the lie suggests that we need a full investigation of what is going on and what is demonstrably an incompetent and, at worst, deceitful federal government.
We still are left with unanswered questions, unaccountability, and facts that come to light that beg new questions or reaffirm unresolved issues during the 9/11 investigation. There needs to be a new investigation.
I don't believe for a minute that we got everything right. We wrote a first draft of history. People will be investigating 9/11 for the next 100 years in this country. And they're going to find out some things that we missed.
We have found that the Commission's definitive final report has actually yielded more questions than answers.
At the top of the family's growing list of questions, why had the U.S. military defenses failed to stop any of the 4 hijacked planes?
That's almost 2 hours, where planes were flying around the skies of the United States with no military response.
Coming across an article in a Canadian paper, the Jersey widows learned it had been a routine for NORAD, the military apparatus in charge of air defense, to scramble fighters to intercept planes during suspected emergencies.
Fatal accident involving a Learjet flying.
The women recalled one such incident that was heavily reported in 1999.
Just 25 minutes into the flight, controllers lost radio contact with the pilots, and an Air Force F-16 on a training mission was sent to take a look. Ultimately, 6 military jets gave chase. The plane was tracked by the FAA on radar. At high levels, the military, even the White House, discussed what to do.
Tell me what the difference was between those times and the day of September 11th.
On this morning, they are in the midst of a full-scale training exercise.
First thing that went through my mind was, is this part of the exercise? Is this some kind of a screw-up?
Personnel were expecting an exercise that day. One shocking element coming from the tapes, a hijacking exercise was planned the same day.
We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need you guys we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise, not a test.
Is that real world? Real world hijack?
No, this is real world.
I've never seen so much real world stuff happen during an exercise.
This is real world. And we're trying to confirm this. I think we put the exercise on the hold. What do you think?
I hope they cancel the exercise because this is ridiculous.
They suspend the exercise? Not at this time, no.
Get rid of this goddamn sim. Turn your turn the sim switches off. Just get rid of that crap.
What we need you to do right now is to terminate all exercise inputs coming in.
The question was, we had 4 war games going on September 11th, whether or not the activities of the 4 war games going on September 11th actually impaired our ability to respond to the attacks.
The answer to the question is no, did not impair our response.
Did that help in terms of were more people prepared, or did this hurt in terms of people thinking, no, there's no possibility that this is real world. We're engaged in an exercise and delay things?
Sir, my belief is that it helped.
There were lots of false signals out there. There were false hijack squawks, and a great part of the challenge was sorting through what was a legitimate threat and what wasn't.
President Bush has said again and again that no one could have imagined what Osama bin Laden ordered for September 11th.
Nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings on such a massive scale.
There were people in the United States who actually were preparing to defend against the kind of attacks which occurred here on 9/11. In the 2 years before the attacks on September the 11th, NORAD conducted exercises using hijacked airliners as weapons. And one target was the World Trade Center.
Conducted exercises with fighter jets, simulating hijacked planes flown into the World Trade Center in the 2 years before the attacks. Pentagon planners also envisioned the attack on the Pentagon 5 months before it happened. Air Force officials wanted a war game, having a terrorist group hijack a commercial airline and fly it into the Pentagon.
I don't think anybody could have predicted that these people would take an airplane and slam it into the World Trade Center, take another one and slam it into the Pentagon, that they would try to use an airplane as a missile, a hijacked airplane as a missile.
We looked at this scenario, hijacked aircraft flying into buildings back in the 60s.
The intelligence community obtained information that a group of unidentified Arabs planned to fly an explosive-laden plane from a foreign country into the World Trade Center. The intelligence community obtained information that Osama bin Laden's next operation could possibly involve flying an aircraft loaded with explosives.
Bin Laden is an interesting individual, to say the least. In the Afghan war, when the Russians occupied Afghanistan for 10 years, he fought on the side of those who were fighting against the Russians, and he fought well. There's varying reports about how well, but then
we aided him, didn't we?
Oh, he was part of the team. He was part of the team.
U.S. agents were told to back off from investigating the bin Laden family.
While there have always been constraints on investigating Saudis, under George Bush, it's gotten much worse. After the elections, the agencies were told to back off investigating the bin Ladens and Saudi royals, and that angered agents.
Ellen Mariani is going to court because she believes her husband is a victim of the biggest government conspiracy in U.S. history. And she's not alone.
My husband was 4 years in the Air Force. Where were his people? Do I feel that the government deliberately did this in our country where our loved ones were killed? Yes.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th.
We are not crazy. We have questions. We demand answers. I don't want to be paternalized by my government. If I question anything about the official story, I'm called a conspiracy theorist. My daughter was on the 93rd floor of Tower 2. And 5 minutes after the first plane hit, Port Authority police and those in the building were told they were safe, that they should stay at their desks.
Your attention, please, ladies and gentlemen. Building 2 is secure. There is no need to evacuate Building 2. If you're in the midst of evacuation, you may use the re-entry doors and the elevators to return to your office. Repeat. Building 2 is secure, and the announcement was repeated.
I was sitting outside the classroom waiting to go in, and I saw an airplane hit the tower of a TV. You know, the TV was obviously on, and I used to fly myself, and I said, well, there's one terrible pilot. And I said it must have been a horrible accident.
The president was surprised. He thought it had to be an accident.
He said, it sounds like a terrible accident. Keep me informed.
I know he saw the August 6th presidential daily briefing that said with absolute specificity, planes, skyscrapers, bin Laden. And Condoleezza Rice testified before that commission and said there was no specificity in those briefings.
First of all, if he knew that the first tower was hit and then still went into the classroom and sat there, that's outrageous. At 8:46, they would have known that something serious was going on and should have responded immediately. The second tower, where my husband was hit at 9:02. That is plenty of time to send out a warning and get the people out.
I was sitting in the classroom, and Andy Card, my chief of staff, who's sitting over here, walked in and said, a second plane has hit the tower, America's under attack.
But the president remained in the classroom for at least 5 more minutes.
10 more, actually. In the classroom, and then he stayed in the school in which he prepared a press statement, and they actually did a press conference from the school. Keep in mind that at this point, as many as 11 planes, there was a suspect that were hijacked. They have no idea where these other planes are going. The president is a highly visible target.
Weren't the children who were in the classroom with the president in danger too?
Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, was at his desk until the Pentagon was hit.
Among those helping the wounded and injured is the 69-year-old Rumsfeld himself. The Secretary of Defense is outside the burning building, while inside the Pentagon,
For 30 minutes, we couldn't find him. Take command in the Pentagon. He didn't show up for over an hour and a half after the first plane was hijacked. Why? The Secretary of Defense.
We were told that the FBI and the CIA were pretty much clueless about what was coming down the pike on September 11th. But on the day of September 11th, they knew it was bin Laden right away. They knew that there were 19 hijackers right away. They knew that it was Al-Qaeda right away.
2 of the alleged terrorists involved in what happened on Tuesday may have attended schools run by the U.S. military.
2 of the hijackers, we believe 2 who died in this hijacking, took pilot training down there and lived in the area and were out drinking in recent weeks.
Both men came in, drank heavily, and then refused to pay the bill.
He said to me, oh, I can pay my bill. I'm an airline pilot.
FBI agents visiting a strip club in Daytona Beach. Just hours before the hijackings, 3 Middle Eastern men there hinted at the violence to come.
One of the gentlemen actually making the statement, well, America's going to see blood and wait till tomorrow.
We are led to believe that these are devout, fundamentalist Muslims, and yet these men were drinking in bar rooms, which if they did this in their host countries, such as Saudi Arabia, they would be subject to execution. So there's a very, very strange picture drawing here.
So the women decided to go to the top. They and other survivors met with the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller.
We asked Director Mueller, what's going on here? We hear that some of these people are actually not who they were supposed to be. We're using aliases, we're using false identities.
14 of the 19 alleged hijackers received their visas from the same office, 12 from the same consular officer.
The applications of the terrorists who killed my husband. All of these forms are incomplete and incorrect.
Flight 77, evading detection for some 36 minutes. Is there any rational explanation for that?
3 of the 4 hijackings took large detours, waiting until they were in a radar gap zone before disconnecting their transponders.
if they were good questions, a lot of times we were told it had to do with national security. They couldn't tell us.
May it have been an inside job? Might these people have gotten help from the inside?
Now there's a lot more evidence that suggests it's almost certainly the case.
A possibility this could be some kind of inside job. Congressman is saying the hijackings at Logan were an inside job.
Federal officials have begun a major investigation into whether someone or many people benefited financially from the evil done to the country last Tuesday. Not long before the attacks occurred, there were some financial transactions in the stock market that may indicate knowledge of the attack before it began.
Stock trades involving some 38 companies. The SEC wants to know if people had prior knowledge of the suicide hijackings and benefited from those trades.
It is absolutely unprecedented to see cases of insider trading covering the entire world, from Japan to the United States and North America to Europe.
Could this be a coincidence? This would be one of the most extraordinary coincidences in the history of mankind if it was a coincidence.
And the answer that we got was, we've investigated and we find no unusual trading activity.
They weren't really forthcoming and truthful with us.
And you'd leave there as frustrated as you left every other meeting.
The FBI and the Commission investigated and concluded the suspicious market activity was linked to a pre-9/11 slump in the airline industry.
The 9/11 Commission would ultimately conclude that the question of who financed the attacks is of little practical significance.
Pentagon. The day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war. Not on foreign terrorists. He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat. Rumsfeld promised change. But the next day, the world changed. The military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. To understand how the Pentagon can lose track of trillions,
that plane had come directly under our section of the offices, the Army Budget Office.
The only small bright spot is that in fact it was an area of the Pentagon that had just been renovated, and a number of the offices were empty at the time.
Had already been vacated, those offices vacated in preparations of the remodeling effort. The number of dead is probably considerably less than it would have been if this part of the Pentagon had been up to full staff. Fortunately, too, this is exactly the opposite side of all the critical command centers in the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense's office, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs office, the National Military Command, where some of the most critical military decisions are made. Fortunately, they were all on the other side of the building.
The only photographic record of the impact is this time-lapse footage from a security camera. Leaked on the internet, it failed to capture what hit the building.
Early on, there were articles that talked about the FBI confiscating tapes.
And we asked that they please subpoena for that video.
Every time we would ask them about those tapes, you had three people rolling their eyes and saying, oh, here's Miss Conspiracy. She doesn't think a plane went into the building. But really, it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with, hey, there's information out there that you could possibly have. Why not get it?
They did not subpoena for this Pentagon videos.
And it made you very unsure of, the Commission's report, and that they were getting all the information that you needed.
So there's evidence that just never got even seen.
I am here today to call for the facts of September 11, 2001 to be released to the American public.
There was a Newsweek story, came out just after 9/11, saying that there were a number of high-level generals that were going to fly that next morning, and that they were given a warning and told not to fly on the morning of September 11th. And then the Newsweek article went on to say, doubtless this is going to become a big issue because, why is it that these people were warned, but the people on the planes that were hijacked weren't given the same warning? And there was no such debate. And then the next issue of Newsweek, they basically repeated that exact same story, and again kind of said that doubtless this will lead to some kind of debate, and again kind of just completely fell on deaf ears. You're not a conspiracy theorist if you just look at the newspaper and you said, I read this in the New York Times and so forth, and I want answers. I want the 9/11 Commission, for instance, to have looked into that Newsweek story and tried to figure out what was going on there. But that was just one of the 70% of the questions that the victims' relatives asked and never got answers to.
Also missing from the Commission's definitive report is testimony from national security whistleblowers who had tried to testify before the Commission, but were either not asked to testify or their testimony was only barely acknowledged, or worse yet, completely omitted from the record.
A former FBI translator with top-secret clearance says she testified before the 9/11 Commission.
Within a few weeks after I started working there, I came across some really serious issues, from security breaches to certain documents from pre-9/11 and also post-9/11 that were being either intentionally blocked or mistranslated.
We had met with Sibel, and she had told us of her story and how she was fired.
The FBI offered no explanation, saying in a letter only that her contract was terminated completely for the government's convenience.
I had a gag order put on her.
We had gone to a lot of, to whoever we knew in the media to bring out her story. And you know what? So many of them had said, oh, it sounds conspiratorial. It sounds like she had a beef. You know, bottom line, 6 months later when, you know, there was reports that came out that said, well, even the FBI had to admit that her story was true, you know, they turn around and look at you and say, oh, well.
Does the Sibel Edmonds case fall into any pattern of behavior, pattern of conduct on the part of the FBI?
The usual pattern. Let me tell you. First of all, the embarrassing information comes out. The FBI reaction is to sweep it under the rug. And then eventually they shoot the messenger.
Special Agent John Roberts, a chief of the FBI's Internal Affairs Department, agrees. Have you found cases since 9/11 where people were involved in misconduct and were not, let alone reprimanded, but were even promoted?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
That's astonishing. Why? Because you would think that after 9/11, that's a big slap on the face. Hello, this is a wake-up call here.
Depends on who you are. If you're in the senior executive level, it may not hurt you. You will be promoted.
I went through the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11. As I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know, he said, sir, we're going to attack Iraq. And I said, why? He said, we don't know. He said, I said, well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, no. And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, oh, sir. He says, it's worse than that. He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And I you know, my mind was spinning. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control.
The Project for the New American Century.
A 76-page white paper circulating for a year and arguing for an aggressive U.S. foreign policy suddenly gained new relevance.
In the blueprint, it says the process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Was 9/11 your Pearl Harbor?
I think it was the country's Pearl Harbor.
Well, September 11th happened, obviously, and George W. Bush had to rethink. But for many of those around Bush, there was no rethink. There didn't have to be. Long before September 11th, a small, influential group of neoconservatives here in Washington had wanted to see the United States transformed into a sort of benevolent ruler, unchallenged, astride the world. And long before George W. Bush was elected, they sat down and they wrote down a manifesto. Much of what these men wanted is coming true. They urged that the U.S. abandon the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It has. They wanted establishment of more permanent U.S. military bases abroad. That is happening in the Philippines and in Georgia and will likely happen in Iraq. They urged regime change as a goal of foreign wars, not just in Iraq. They wanted the U.S. as a global constabulary, their word, unburdened by the UN or world opinion, preventing any challenge to U.S. dominance. But, they wrote, a year before September 11th, such aspirations are unlikely to be realized without a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
The main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't.
What did Iraq have to do with what? The attack on the World Trade Center. Nothing.
The man who led the search for weapons of mass destruction throughout Iraq says the intelligence was almost all wrong.
Former Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski was at the Pentagon.
Having seen the intelligence, I knew that this was a manipulation of information. It was cherry-picked information, out-of-context information, in many cases information presented as confirmed when in fact it had not been ever confirmed by the intelligence community. And I saw it to be conscious manipulation, not an oversight, but consciously done.
Greg Thielman was an intelligence specialist with the State Department.
Their starting point was not, let's try to figure out what was going on, but let's see what kind of information we can come up with to justify the policy line that we wish to pursue.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here. Oops, this photo wasn't supposed to be in here. This is the Skull and Bone secret signal.
Nearly 3,000 people died at the World Trade Center on 9/11, but the list of victims keeps growing. Many now suffer from illnesses officially linked to the toxic smoke and dust, including respiratory and gastric diseases.
We all heard in the beginning, the air was good, it's okay.
Yeah.
Now that very same government's saying, well, cancer's not part of it.
In the wake of 9/11, there were serious concerns about whether the air around Ground Zero was filled with toxins, unsafe for workers and residents. But by September 18th, many New Yorkers were back in their apartments and on the job, partly because of this press release that day from the Environmental Protection Agency, reassuring New Yorkers that their air is safe to breathe. Was that press release misleading?
It was surely not telling all of the truth.
The first EPA official to warn that dust in the air around the World Trade Center could pose a serious health risk. Jenkins accused the EPA of intentionally hiding the dangers of air pollution at Ground Zero. She was fired in 2010.
New York City directly lied about the test results for asbestos in air. When they finally released them, they doctored the results. They changed high hazardous levels to 0.
Sally Reaganhard, who had lost her firefighter son Christian in the building's collapse, was forming the Skyscraper Safety Campaign.
The largest structural collapse in world history, the largest loss of life on American soil since the Civil War, and not one governmental or elected official wanted to know why and how this happened.
Why did the buildings fall? How could skyscrapers just crumple to the ground in 10 seconds.
Since 2001, I've been researching the tragedy of September 11th and how the unanswered questions still linger on. I'd like answers about building number 7 coming down at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th.
I lost my husband.
My son.
My uncle.
My nephew. September 11th, 2001.
Most people don't know a third tower fell that day.
The government says fire brought it down.
The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
I, along with 1,400 other architects and engineers,
have found the government's conclusion to be physically impossible.
This is Building 7, a 47-story skyscraper that fell on the afternoon of September 11th.
The government says that fire brought it down. However, 1,500 architects and engineers concluded it was a controlled demolition. I'm a structural engineer.
I'm a New York City correction officer.
I'm an Air Force pilot.
I'm an architect of 20 years, member of the American Institute of Architects, and have been studying steel-framed, fireproof buildings for about that long. Fires in high-rises have never brought down a steel-frame high-rise building at all, ever. In the case of Building 7, it collapses straight down into its own footprint at free-fall speed in the first 100 feet. It's dropping, as you can see, symmetrically, smoothly, at free fall speed in the first 100 feet, 2.5 seconds. This is uncanny. There's 40,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist this collapse.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
I worked at NIST for 14 years. Starting in 1997, it became clear to me that NIST's investigation of the collapse of the World Trade Centers was not a sincere and genuine study.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with a video of the event.
Does the model that NIST produced for World Trade 7 match what we actually saw? What we see in the NIST model, first, they only play the first few seconds of it. We only see a little bit of the building beginning to collapse. It is extremely atypical to build a computer model and create an animation of that model and to show only the first part of it. And what we do see doesn't match what we saw in reality.
Well, it's been a point of controversy now for more than a decade.
Dr. Leroy Hulsey, a civil engineering professor at UAF, he led a 4-year study which reevaluates whether Building 7's collapse could have been caused by fire. His findings were a resounding no, and his simulations paint a different picture than the federal agencies.
It was almost as if it were a planned implosion. It just pancaked.
We don't even know whether this was something that was engineered for safety reasons or it just happened.
And I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. Looked like it had been done by a demolition crew.
All right, get back. All right,
I know.
Keep your eye on that building as they coming down.
Building about to blow up.
Well, me and Mr. Hesh, the Corporation Counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor.
As the only documented eyewitness testimony of the events taking place inside World Trade Center 7 during the hours of the attack, the accounts of Barry Jennings and Michael Hess are essential to coming to an understanding of the destruction of that building.
I'm just confused about one thing, and one thing only. Why World Trade Center 7 went down in the first place. I'm very confused about that. I know what I heard. I heard explosions.
Jennings' vivid description of the explosions that were taking place in the building during his ordeal is in direct contradiction to NIST's assertion in its FAQ on WTC-7 that, although NIST investigated the possibility of explosions contributing to the building's demolition, NIST concluded that blast events inside the building did not occur and found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. But Jennings' personal account confirms that there were numerous explosions taking place inside WTC-7 in the morning, hours before the building was destroyed. The BBC attempted to bring Jennings' story in line with the official story by purposely misleading its viewers about the timeline that Jennings himself insisted on.
At that time, I received a phone call from one of my higher-ups. He said, "Where are you?" And I said, at, the Emergency Command Center. A long pause. And then he came back and he said, "Get out of there now."
At 9:59, the 1,300-foot South Tower collapses.
I wanted to get out of that building in a hurry. So I started, instead of taking one step at a time, I'm jumping landings. When I reached down to the 6th floor, there was this eerie sound. The whole building went dark, and the staircase that I was standing on just gave way.
At 10:28, the North Tower collapses in just 11 seconds. With their editing and narrative intrusions, the BBC makes it seem that the explosions that Jennings and Hess experienced were just remnants of the Twin Towers hitting WTC-7. But in his interview with Dylan Avery and Jason Burmis, Jennings was completely adamant that he could still see both towers standing after the explosions happened.
The whole reason that Building 7 collapsed, allegedly, is because the North Tower fell onto it and caused damage. And what people are going to say is, they're going to say, well, Barry was hit by debris from the North Tower.
No. What happened was, when we made it back to the 8th floor, as I told you earlier,
yes,
both buildings were still standing. When I got to the 6th floor, before all this happened, when I got to the 6th floor, there was an explosion. That's what forced us back to the 8th floor. Okay. Both buildings were still standing.
Keep in mind, I told you the fire department came and ran. They came twice. Why? Because building Tower 1 fell, then Tower 2 fell. And then when they came back with all concern now, like, to get me the hell out of there. And they did. And we got out of there. I got in the building a little before 9, a little after 9. I didn't get out of there until like 1. And that's when I found out Building 7 came down. I was so surprised. And I'm saying to myself, why did that building come down? And I knew why it came down, because of the explosions. And the explanations that were given to me is totally unacceptable. Totally unacceptable.
Given Barry Jennings' personal experience, what did he make of the BBC's attempts to alter the timeline of his story? How did he react to the official government viewpoint that no explosions took place in the building that day? What did he think of NIST's refusal to even examine the evidence of controlled demolition of WTC-7, or their own computer-generated model of how thermal expansion and regular office fires brought down a 47-story steel-framed office tower? Sadly, we will never know. In September 2008, just as NIST was presenting its final report, it was reported that Barry Jennings had passed away in hospital the month before. No further details of his death were offered.
You're not trying to freak out the country, but you can't help but feel a little freaked out by this.
Yeah, you're getting it.
Yeah.
I certainly am much more open-minded about it than I was, and it is because of the involvement of the 9/11 families and all these engineers and architects.
7 World Trade had not yet come down, so they did manage, one, to take that down in a controlled implosion later on.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
A fire broke out last night in the World Trade Center. The fire began in an electrical wiring closet on the 11th floor. The fire spread to 6 other floors. There was also no sprinkler system in the building. Even without a sprinkling system, fire department officials and building officials here say that there's no chance the World Trade Center could become a type of towering inferno.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners.
The towers were the first skyscrapers ever explicitly built to survive the impact of a plane.
We had designed the project for the impact of our largest airplane of its time. That is to take this jet airplane, run it into the building, destroy a lot of structure, and still have it stand up.
After months of analysis, NIST concluded that the World Trade Center had no structural flaws that could account for its collapse.
The Twin Towers were designed to sustain the impact of a large airliner traveling at 600 miles per hour and still remain standing. The structural engineer who designed the Twin Towers stated, "We looked at every possible thing we could think of that could happen to the buildings, even to the extent of an airplane hitting the side. Our analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel from the airplane would dump into the building. There would be a horrendous fire, a lot of people would be killed. The building structure would still be there."
We designed the buildings to take the impact of the Boeing 707 hitting the building at any location.
He is a 9/11 survivor, the last person out of the World Trade Center North Tower. Well, on September 11th, William Rodriguez saved an estimated hundreds of people from the World Trade Center after putting his own life on the line. He then became trapped under the debris from the tower for hours before rescuers managed to free him from the rubble.
I worked in the building for 20 years. I was the person in charge of all the stairwells of the North Tower. And on 9/11, I had the only master key that opened the doors that rescue people. This is the master key. They call it the key of hope. And basically, I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement. And this is prior to the building got hit by the plane. And then the plane hit, and then there was a series of explosions afterwards.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building. Then another plane
hit the other building.
They report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
Well, you've been to the White House 5 times. You've been honored by the president, President Bush. You've met Hillary Clinton. That must have been quite an honor for you.
It was an experience, definitely. And at that time, I was basically loaded to go into politics because they said this is the guy that we need to get the Latino vote. And I was playing the whole game of politics because I was doing the activism. And until the moment that I started to ask questions about what really happened on 9/11. And you may remember the whole thing about the 9/11 Commission to be formed, and basically became very active to get it basically started. And what a surprise. I was one of the persons that testified for the 9/11 Commission, and my testimony doesn't appear on the final report.
Willie, I could talk to you until 11 o'clock tonight when we go off the air, but we unfortunately have to wrap it up.
Basically, what I'm doing is telling the people what really happened on 9/11 because there's a lot of disinformation about what happened.
That at the same time 2 planes hit the building, that the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
A van that was parked in the building that may have had some type of explosive device in it.
Bombs may have been placed at the base of those buildings.
The terrorists would have planted bombs, 2 of them, one under each tower.
And there may have been secondary explosions as well that were detonated in the building by these terrorists.
There may have been something else that brought those buildings down.
Started running, floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
That was an incredible explosion.
And that does not cause it could have been something that was planted.
Or a bomb planted in the building, yeah. Is it possible that just a plane crash could have collapsed these buildings? Or would it have required the sort of prior positioning of other explosives in the building? This was clearly, the way the structure is collapsing, this was the result of something that was planned.
I am reasonably sure that it was not the impact of the plane the one that did this.
Possibly a bomb?
Since that time, we know that another bomb was set off at the World Trade Center.
Evidence of other explosives there.
Below the fire, I saw from the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits just went down, and then I just saw the whole building just went, and as the bombs were going, people just started running, and I sat there and watched. It just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
A secondary device, that is another bomb going off.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Was the plane loaded with explosives? Was the plane enough in and of itself to crash in the building to bring those 2 towers down? Because you'll see the video, and you've seen it 100 times. It looked like it was a controlled implosion. It didn't fall over. It looked as if somebody put TNT all throughout that building. It pancaked from floor to floor to floor.
Yes.
So, of course, there's speculation here that maybe these planes were loaded with C4 explosives or some type of explosives on timers. That if the plane itself didn't bring it down, that charges would go off.
So the fact that the trade tower seems to have completely disintegrated, virtually completely disintegrated as they fell down upon themselves. There's almost nothing left of any of the floors.
Where is all the rubble? It seems so flattened. How could so much steel and concrete just vaporize? Did it all turn to dust?
And while it's true there are 6 floors below street level now filled with debris, engineers at the firm that built the building's best guess to account for the missing 1,200 feet of material from each tower is that large portions simply vaporized.
I was astonished at the degree to which solid materials were turned into pulverized dust as a consequence of that building collapse. I think it was striking.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer.
I haven't seen a door, I haven't seen a phone, I haven't seen a computer, I haven't seen a doorknob.
The hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
Officials found a passport belonging to one of the terrorists. That was apparently found a couple of blocks away because when one of the planes, or the first plane, slammed into the tower, you could see it on the video, in fact, debris flew out the other end. There's a belief that some of the cockpit just kept on going, and with that velocity went right through the building. Sources here on the ground had told me that they even found some body parts in the cockpit area. they believe that it is one of the terrorist bodies from the cockpit because the clothing did not match clothing of airline pilots.
Or the people who attacked the United States in New York, shot down the plane over Pennsylvania and attacked the Pentagon.
Within 45 seconds or a minute of impact, we were there. We were there before any firemen, any paramedics, or anybody. We were on site. When we got there was a plane flying up above, and he was smart. He flew straight for the sun, so you couldn't look at it and see exactly what type of plane or if it was a fighter or what it was. But we caught a glimpse of it, and as he was swinging, he was basically traveling in the same direction as the plane.
When I got up here almost to the stop sign, this small white plane, at the time that's what I thought it was, went over top of me. It was so smooth, and it just glided right over me, just like that. And then it just banked to the right and went over and went down behind those trees. We got to watching it on TV, and they kept saying that it was a large plane, like a 757. And I was like, no. What I saw was no jet. That would have blown me off the road if it went over me, that close. I said, no, that wasn't it. About 11:30 that night, the FBI came, wanted to talk to me. They kept asking me how big the plane was. I said the plane, it was small, wasn't much bigger than my van that I saw, and that it went over top of me. And he says, you don't know what a 757 looks like. And I said, don't be condescending to me. If you don't want to believe me, that's fine. But what I saw, I thought I should report. And you ought to know there was something else in the air at the same time this was going on. And you want to make sure maybe it was ours and not somebody else's. And then that's when he did seem to get a little nicer. Told me that it was a white Learjet. Someone was taking pictures. I said, before the crash? And he says, well, we got to go. And that was the end of it.
Debris from that crash has been located miles and miles away from the crash scene.
The FBI and the state police here have confirmed that they have cordoned off a second area about 6 to 8 miles away from the crater here where this plane went down. This is apparently another debris site, which raises a number of questions. Why would debris from the plane, and they identified it specifically as being from this plane, why would debris be located 6 miles away? Could it have blown that far away? Seems highly unlikely. 6 miles away, they have another concentration of debris. They say it's very small pieces. Most of these are very small pieces. Most of the pieces here are no bigger than the size of a briefcase, they say, and the pieces 6 miles away, maybe even smaller than that.
So you can say this is not typical for a plane crash to be spread across an area this large.
It certainly doesn't make sense.
Today, investigators found debris from the crash in a neighborhood about 8 miles away from the area where the plane went down. They say the debris was scattered by the wind.
And then about 6 miles away up by a lake, there is another area that's been cordoned off, and state police and the FBI have said definitely there is debris from the plane located there.
Witnesses have said that they saw the plane actually flying upside down with the tail down, and that it plunged into the earth at least a 60-degree angle, possibly straight down, which would account for the small crater about 20 feet around and at least 10 or 20 feet deep. The bulk of the remains of that plane and all the 45 people who are on board may be buried deep in that crater.
I get up there and I look around, John, and it was like, it's like, where's the plane? There was just pieces, just small pieces you could pick up and put in your palm of your hand, just scattered everywhere.
How little debris is visible. That's really all you see is a large crater in the ground and just tiny, tiny bits of debris. There has been at least one report that the investigators out there, and there are hundreds of them, as I said tonight, have found nothing larger than a phone book.
That is where United Flight 93 crashed into the earth and nearly vaporized.
In the days after the September attacks, there were countless rumors about strange coincidences surrounding the events. One report about a group of Middle Eastern men spotted the morning of September 11th parked just across the river from New York City has not gone away. Investigation of their presence has led to questions about whether Israel was conducting espionage on U.S. soil.
It began when this woman was watching the Twin Towers burning from her apartment in New Jersey. She noticed 3 men on top of a van, posing for pictures with the towers burning in the background.
and I could see that they were like happy. You know, they didn't look shocked to me. You know, they didn't look shocked.
The witness called police, who stopped the van hours later and arrested 5 men. All 5, it turns out, were Israeli. They were turned over to the FBI. Sources tell ABC News during a check of national security databases, some of the men were listed as having had connections with Israeli intelligence. The men said they were just taking pictures at the time. They said they worked for a company called Urban Moving. The FBI obtained a search warrant for the company's offices. Not long after the arrests, the offices of Urban Moving were simply abandoned. Almost everything was left behind. In jail, the 5 Israelis were repeatedly interrogated and given lie detector tests.
Yuval Aviv is a counterterrorism advisor to the U.S. Congress, but was once a spy for Israel's secret service Mossad. He says Urban Moving was a front company for Israeli intelligence.
According to the FBI, 2 of those movers were identified as Mossad agents.
The driver of the moving van, Sivan Kurzberg. We are Israeli. We are not your problem. Your problems are our problems. The Palestinians are the problem.
FBI reports confirmed that the men were not taking somber pictures of a horrific event. When their 76 pictures were developed, they revealed the men had indeed been celebrating, smiling, hugging each other, and high-fiving. One of the pictures even featured Sivan Kurzberg holding a lighter up with the burning tower in the background. They lied to the police about where they had been that morning. They were carrying plane tickets for immediate departure to different places around the globe. The FBI confirmed that 2 of the men had ties to Israeli intelligence and came to suspect that they had indeed been on a mission for the Mossad. The FBI reports show how the men gave confused and often conflicting accounts of when and how they learned about what was happening and when they arrived at the parking lot. Oded Elner even said they had arrived there shortly after 8 a.m., which would have been 45 minutes before the attacks even began. This is in line with one of the eyewitnesses that had placed their Urban Moving Systems van at the parking lot at 8 a.m. They were immediately transferred to federal custody, held for 71 days, and then deported back to Israel. They were just spying on Arab terrorists.
And while the FBI or certain sources might believe that in fact they were Israeli intelligence, they don't believe that the U.S. was a target, that they were actually investigating Muslim groups?
They believe if this was an intelligence operation by Israel, that it was focused on the Islamic groups and charities that raise money for groups that are considered by U.S. law enforcement and others terrorist groups.
What about this question of advanced knowledge of what was going to happen on 9/11? How clear are investigators that some Israeli agents may have known something?
Well, it's very explosive information, obviously, and there's a great deal of evidence that they say they have collected. None of it necessarily conclusive. It's more when they put it all together. A bigger question, they say, is how could they not have known?
Israelis who were detained in the anti-terror investigation, and the suspicion that some investigators have that they may have picked up information on the 9/11 attacks ahead of time, not passed it on. There was a report, you'll recall, that the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, did indeed send representatives to the U.S. to warn, just before 9/11, that a major terrorist attack was imminent.
But investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. A highly placed investigator said there are, quote, tie-ins. But when asked for details, he flatly refused to describe them, saying, quote, evidence linking these Israelis to 911 is classified. I cannot tell you about evidence that has been gathered. It's classified information.
People who believe in conspiracy theories, and particularly this one about WTC-7, don't understand government and clearly have never worked in government. Anyone who's ever worked in government will tell you 2 things. That the government doesn't have the competence to do a large-scale conspiracy like this. And number 2, it can't maintain secrecy. There's almost nothing that I know of in 30 years of having top-secret clearances that hasn't come out in the Washington Post and the New York Times.
Are there really great secrets that you know that you can't share with people?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are. And you never write about them.
No.
Maybe at a time in your life that you're like, oh, I'm 90, I'm going to do it.
No.
No, nothing.
It is hard for mere laymen to understand how the biggest, most extensive military in the world could not have got fighters in the air that morning faster than it did.
You know, it's really interesting. The conspiracy theorists, one of the very common mistakes they make is what I call the myth of hypercompetence. They've seen too many movies. They have this idea that the minute a plane goes off course, 3, fighter jets are scrambled on its tail within seconds. It doesn't actually work that way. They're assuming that the air defenses were competent to fight this kind of threat. They weren't. They should have been better prepared for it. They should have thought about it. They should have trained for it.
But they do train for it.
The people who are asking those questions are imagining some kind of government conspiracy that would involve the entire staffs of a half dozen airports, the entire CIA, U.S. military, the entire journalistic establishment. Hundreds of thousands of people would be keeping this secret today. How credible is that?
I started out as a spy back in the 1990s. I worked for the British spy agency MI5 and then ended up leaving, resigning, and blowing the whistle on their crimes and incompetence. If you want to run any sort of terrorist or false flag attack, it's very much need to know because it's usually highly illegal. So there might be 1 or 2 people who have the overall picture, and then other people will have compartmentalized views of what is happening. And there's very much a need to know. I mean, other projects have been kept very well hidden for years. In the Manhattan Project to develop nuclear weapons, I think 130,000 people were involved in that, and nobody breathed a word for years. Same with the Iran-Contra scandal in the 80s, about 5,000 people involved, and it took years for that to be uncovered. So even if it were the case that thousands of people were involved in something illegal on 9/11, coming out of the American administration, the American government, they would probably keep quiet. And also, where would their interest lie in going public about it? One, it would certainly ruin their livelihoods, and it might well jeopardize other things up to and including their lives. So there's a strong incentive to keep quiet if you're involved in those sort of things. You've got to bear in mind that there is this sort of standard weapon that intelligence agencies use, which is false flag terrorism, to gain their political ends. The way 9/11 has been misused to act as the foundation for the war on terror, to justify the wars in the Middle East, to justify the shredding of our constitutions, is disgraceful. And there is such a mountain of evidence to disprove the official account. I think if we can get that evidence in front of people, it would be very easy to bring down the whole house of cards. Disprove 9/11, we disprove the war on terror, the need for wars, the need for the shredding of our freedoms.
I just want to ask what your message is to the Iraqi people who are wondering.
You're free, and freedom is beautiful. And, it'll take time to restore chaos and order, but we're order out of chaos, but we will. Yeah, John. Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we.